God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men, and meeting next week, you'll notice in the budget that we have budgeted for a new pastoral position. We have to let you know 2 weeks ahead of time when we are going to vote on a new pastoral position. This is a pastor of counseling, and I'm going to ask Randy Munsabais to come up and explain just what would a pastor of counseling be doing so that you'll know that. And we give you 2 weeks, and then on February the 2nd, we will vote to determine whether we will accept him as a new pastor here at Grace Bible Church. Looks like it's on.
Good morning. There's always one. It occurs to me that some of you may not even know that I've been doing counseling here since we moved here. Gosh, it'll be 4 years in a couple of months. Met with the elders when we moved here. It's something I've been doing since 1992. I was talking to a gentleman last night about people that just are, they're just good at a lot of things. They can do carpentry, and they can fix cars, and they can just do, I don't like those people. It's all I know is what God's called me to do, and it's my passion. It's to help the body of Christ heal, because sometimes we're hurt, and to get back in the fight. So again, I met with the elders then, have been doing it for a while. My home run would be to be able to be here and have more time allotted, because right now I just don't have the time to expand ministry into the community that we could offer as a ministry out of Grace Bible Church. Right now, because of my time having to be split other ways, I just don't. But that I would love to be able to do that, and if it's seen as a viable ministry by the congregation, then we'll move forward. If it's not, then we'll probably continue just doing what we're doing with the time allotted. But I think it would be a wonderful, viable ministry for the community to be able to offer that. So I guess we'll talk some more next week.
And feel free to ask Randy any questions that you have during these next 2 weeks as well. If you're new here, there should be a communication card in the seat in front of you. If you'd please fill that out, we'd love to get to know you. And also, I have a free book to give to you after the service, so I hope I'll be able to do that. It's called A Praying Life by Paul Miller. What time is the worship service next week? 10 a.m. So don't show up here for 9:30 for Sunday school. We're not having Sunday school at 9:30. And don't show up for 10:45 for worship, because it's going to be at 10. And we'll get done early so that we can have our annual meeting after that. Well, I'm sure you've been wondering. Does somebody have a question? Yes. That's next week. Yeah, the 26th. Yeah, the 26th is our annual meeting. We're voting on Randy on the 2nd of February. I don't know, that may have gotten you a little bit mixed up there. All right, so I'm sure you've been wondering, what in the world is this sermon title, The Church as an Emotional System? We've been talking in this series of sermons about relationships. The goal of this series is to help us to develop ways to have healthier relationships. If we really want to become the most loving place in town, that we not only have to value the fact that we've been created for community, we have to find our unity to be very precious to us, but we also have to learn how to deal with the anxiety or even the anger that flares up at times between two or more people. And so the idea of an emotional system is just reflecting the reality that when you have two or more people, no matter what their relationships, there will be times when emotions escalate. when anxiety and anger begins to affect that relationship. And the reality is, what runs and ultimately ruins churches is not rational thinking, but emotional responses. In fact, the Bible encourages us to think of the church as a family, and churches interact with one another, and they fight with one another just like families do. In times of stress and conflict, challenge and change, church families act as predictably as nuclear families do. And the degree of collective emotional and spiritual maturity in a church is the significant variable in how well the congregation weathers such times. Just like our bodies consist of a system of organic systems that have to work together in order for there to be health in the body, so in the church, each of us is a part of the system. We each have our own part to play. While we function together, we each have a distinct way that we are a part of that body. And Larry Dossey reminds us that from the atom to the organism to the person, the pattern that meets us in nature is that of connection and contact. In a world of living organisms, isolation is nowhere met. And so Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 12:27 that we're all members of the body. He says this, now you are collectively the body of Christ and individually members of it. So there's a sense in which we are a body, but there's also a sense in which we're individual members. Now think of a mobile. When you had a child and you had that child in the crib, you probably bought a mobile and hung it in front of them because it would fascinate them. But when you pull one part of the mobile, what happens to the rest of it? Everything moves, doesn't it? And that's the thing with a system. When one thing happens within a family system or within a church system, it affects the whole system. That's why we're talking about an emotional system. Any change in life is a loss. Bad things like death, job loss, breakups create loss. But even positive changes like a new job, a home, or a partner, that creates a loss because the old situation now is gone and you have to adjust to a new one. With change comes loss, and often with loss comes grief. And as long as people gather and interact, emotional processes occur. Now, there are positive aspects of these processes, things like joy and comfort, support, cooperation, friendship, but emotional systems are innately anxious. The downside, therefore, is that the intense anxiety that distracts the congregation from its purpose and sets people at odds against one another and builds walls against others. And so Peter Steinke in his book, not Stinky, Steinke, Healthy Congregation says, no problem is seen in isolation. The problem is in the whole, not in the parts. The system is the locus of the problem. The problem is in the interrelation of the parts. Systems thinking considers the interrelatedness of all those parts, seeing them instead of seeing them as isolated and unrelated parts. And what does this mean? It means that the problem is never simply in an individual. Every problem involves all mutually related parts, whether in a family or in a church. So let's take, for example, that if I am passive, my wife may get angry. Was the problem her or me? It's both. In the system, we are affecting one another. We are influencing one another. And in the systems, there's a recognition that it's the connection between people that needs to be worked on. It says we can only be understood fully in terms of the context of our relationships. The New Testament commands are all recognizing that we are involved in relationships. When you get mad at someone. When you get sad because of someone or something that happens. And thus when we interact, emotional and physiological processes happen. And we are mutually influencing. When I do something that upsets you, both your body and your emotions will react. Now you can react immediately from the amygdala. Okay, you wonder, what is the amygdala? The amygdala is part of the brain. And that part of the brain is what helps you to respond immediately to threats. Just for example, if a vehicle pulls into your lane what immediately starts to happen? Your heart begins to race, your focus begins to get sharper, your foot goes to the brake, you swerve the wheel. All of those things happen automatically. Those are instinctive responses that we have. And they're good, they're helpful to us, but we can't stay in that instinctive response mode too long. We have to learn then to move that reaction to our neocortex and begin to think about, okay, what are the options? What are the ways that we can deal with it? What other perspectives can we have about this? So it's the part of the brain that processes things automatically, like our circulation, our blood flow, things like that, our respiration. Or we can slow down our process and we can begin to process things through our neocortex. That's a larger part of our brain, and that larger part of our brain allows us to slow down, to analyze things, and to think of options and to think of possibilities. When we are normally anxious, we act before we think, right? That's what tends to happen. When we respond and we attack somebody, we're acting before we really think about what we're doing. Isn't this what Jesus encouraged us to do in Matthew chapter 7, to slow down and think about ourselves rather than the other person? Remember, he says, instead of thinking about taking the toothpick out of the other person's eye, stop and take the telephone pole out of your own eye. Then you can help the other person. And so we deal with ourselves first. Not the other person, not the person that we're blaming for being a part of the problem, and they are part of the problem, but we are responsible for ourselves. So we need to stop thinking of problems in terms of a single individual, that is the other person, and we need to begin to see all these problems as mutual. Instead of thinking simply that A affects B, we recognize that A affects B, and B affects A, and A affects B, and so on. These are mutual influences upon one another. We all affect each other. And when things start to go wrong, it's easy to see how others are behaving incorrectly and how they impact us, but it's difficult to see what we're doing to impact them and influence them. So instead of thinking in lines, as you see up here, we need to think in loops. In other words, when you and I have a problem, it's not just you to blame or me to blame, but both of us have contributed in some way to that problem. And as Edwin Friedman, a family counselor who wrote a book called Generation to Generation, said, anxious systems diagnose people instead of their relationships.